Hello, good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Nikki Schultek, the principal and founder of Intracell Research, looking at whether or not infection is a likely cause of Alzheimer's disease. Wonderful to have you here today, Nikki.
Thank you, Philip. It's wonderful to meet you and to be here to talk and to put a fancy shirt on, right, when no one's getting dressed because I work from home.
And so we always ask, what's the weather like?
It is actually pretty nice in North Carolina today. We had some big storms earlier, but it's like 72 degrees and breezy, so I can't complain.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I hope that you're in lockdown at the moment, are you?
Oh, we sure are, just venturing from one room to the next, taking walks with our dog. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So listen, Nikki, what I want you to do first is introduce yourself to our audience. I want you to tell us about your background and so on, and then we'll take it from there.
Wonderful, that sounds great. So thank you guys for joining us today, whoever's tuned in. As Philip mentioned, I'm Nikki Schultek. I'm the founder of something called Intracell Research Group, and what we are is a global consortium of people that are interested in shedding light on the role of chronic infections and chronic human diseases like Alzheimer's disease. And essentially, it's like a spider web. It's a connected net of individuals that work in science, in medicine directly with patients, people in business, all different disciplines in and around this concept of infection and disease.
Wonderful. And so tell me, in the context of dementia, one of the first questions I always ask people is, have you had any personal experience with regards to dementia?
Sure. So it's interesting. I actually came to be involved in all of this because I had been quite sick and was a patient myself, not of Alzheimer's and dementia, but I did have the unfortunate opportunity to be sick in my early 30s with several different chronic diseases. And I ended up being diagnosed with a few different chronic infections, one of them that's commonly known as Lyme disease. And in the course of being sick, I had symptoms consistent with neurodegenerative disease. So I had, brain fog and loss of my cognitive function and weakness and a lot of very disturbing symptoms that came along with being sick. And then I unfortunately had one of my very favorite mentors, my first mentor in the medical space, a doctor that I worked with when I was in my early 20s. Unfortunately, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and no longer has the ability to really engage and remember anything. He hasn't been working for several years now. So it certainly is something that I feel passionate about advancing our understanding.
Wow, wow, wow. That's quite remarkable to know. And it seems to have driven a lot of the work that you do and a lot of the research that you do, because you've come at it even from a non-medical background, but did very heavy research into what was affecting you at the time and driven where you've gone now.
Yeah, so when I got sick 5 years ago, I sort of embarked on a journey to learn as much as I could. And I had worked with pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer and Genentech. So I had the background to understand medical literature. And when I had literally one of these mystery diagnoses where I had 12 different specialists, I came to realize that our system is very siloed. You know, you have people working on one area of the body or one particular specialty, not necessarily communicating with the others. And that at that time, I felt very compelled to believe I was systemically sick. I had all of these different chronic inflammatory diseases, and no one was really regarding it as a big picture. So I started to do my own research when I really literally feared my life. And that was what drove me to the point where I started surfing PubMed like crazy, reading publications, and came upon a body of research on chlamydia pneumoniae, which is a bacteria that most of us are infected with by the time we reach midlife, but very few people even know about. It's a distinct thing from the sexually transmitted chlamydia. It's actually transmitted the same way the common cold is. You breathe it in. It's a respiratory pathogen. And when I found this body of research, I was sort of amazed because there is a ton of literature in credible peer-reviewed journals, even clinical trials looking at treating underlying chronic infection in various devastating diseases. And yet the body of research really hasn't gone anywhere. So I decided to get directly involved in the areas in which there was the greatest unmet need and the largest amount of evidence. And that's where Alzheimer's really stands out.
So your story is quite inspiring. And it's one of the things that I usually say to people, in that whenever you have a passion for something, it does not matter if you put your energy and focus on it. It shows you how far and how much you can do with regards to it. That is quite inspiring and should be encouragement to anyone who has an interest in any area of medicine to be able to research it and focus on it.
Yeah, Philip, it's been such an honor, honestly. And for me, at the end of the day, this is about helping people. It's not about generating revenue. And I think because this whole thing is mission driven, it's literally for me to be able to look at my young kids and say, okay, I was sick, this really bad thing happened to me, but I took that and learned from it. And then I applied what I learned to help other people. And in the end, we don't have the answer as to whether or not infections drive Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And I'm just here to point out that we really need to fill in the missing puzzle pieces and answer those questions.
This leads us right into that first question.
Yeah.
Is it too simple to think that infection is the likely cause of such a complex disease?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and one that I get a lot. And I love the question because there's really nothing simple about the microorganisms that have gotten involved and are associated with Alzheimer's disease. So when you think about infection in Alzheimer's, you have the #1 associated organism is herpes simplex virus, which causes cold sores. The next one is chlamydia pneumoniae, which is a bacterial infection that has the ability to enter human cells, including immune system cells, and ride into the brain, kind of like a Trojan horse, or actually enter through the nose when you breathe it in, and then get directly into the brain through the olfactory nerve. So essentially, there's really nothing simple about the way the organisms behave. And really the thing that I think is the most compelling piece of evidence that microbes are in some way involved is the fact that when you look at the disease itself and the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease from a pathological point of view, and then you look at the organisms possess the capabilities of eliciting a lot of the things that we see in Alzheimer's disease. For example, amyloid beta is an antimicrobial peptide. That has been a very compelling piece of evidence. Another piece of evidence is the fact that Alzheimer's, you can observe mitochondrial dysfunction and depletion in the brain cells. And chlamydia pneumoniae, for example, is a mitochondrial parasite. And what that means is that in order to do its thing, it basically moves into our cells and begins stealing energy from our mitochondria. So it's actually a little pirate, essentially. And while it's doing it, it also has the capability of eliciting an inflammatory cascade and the release of something called heat shock protein 60. Now, when that happens, the human cells also release endogenous heat shock protein 60, and it just creates this inflammatory cascade. So, that's just one of the organisms. Now, the others, like spirochetes, Lyme disease is the common one people know about, Borrelia burgdorferi. Yeah. That has been discovered in Alzheimer's postmortem brain tissues, and it too has the ability to be intracellular. It has the ability to hide out in biofilm. And chlamydia has the ability to sort of revert to like an unhatched egg, where it is basically hiding and it's infectious, but it's not very actively metabolizing. And when it's in that state, it is very difficult to kill. In fact, short courses of our normal antibiotics only put chlamydia into a more persistent state. So, there are definitely ways in which the organisms behave. They're quite complex and really sort of overlay with some of the hallmarks and features of the disease.
No, that's quite interesting. One of the things that I usually say, because I've heard the theory many times, and I guess one of the things that I used to say is that we do know that certain organisms cause dementia. We mentioned things like Whipple's disease, syphilis, HIV. The question was whether or not, in a broad sense, when we look across the world, the 50 million people who are affected, or even with mild cognitive impairment, can we therefore think that that huge body of individuals are all likely to have chronic infection across the world. I think that's one of the challenges. But I'm listening very carefully, especially to what you said about the chlamydia and its intracellular actions. And it does fit with a lot of the research about what can happen with regards to inflammatory responses and critically mitochondrial dysfunction.
You mentioned about the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease globally. So these organisms that we're referencing, particularly herpes simplex and chlamydia pneumoniae, are fairly ubiquitous, meaning that the majority of us have been exposed and are harboring these bugs. And the question is their presence in the brain, in very large quantities in people that succumb to Alzheimer's disease? If you compare those brain tissues to those of normal healthy individuals that are of the same age that didn't have Alzheimer's or dementia diagnosis, you see a lot more of the organisms, and it is statistically significant. So the question is, do they arrive? I mean, one of the very many scientific questions that needs to be answered, do they arrive after the fact, and some other blood-brain barrier insufficiency precedes that? We know that one of the fascinating data points is the presence of the ApoE4 allele, or the Alzheimer's gene. Some of us are more genetically vulnerable to developing Alzheimer's disease and dementia, particularly those that carry 2 copies of that ApoE4 gene. The thing that serves as another piece of evidence that microorganisms are important is the body of evidence showing that ApoE4 carriage, particularly in those that have 2 copies, means that you are essentially a better host to a variety of infections. And literature, again, it goes back to connecting the silos. If you think about Alzheimer's research and you think about infectious diseases in microbiology, those are very disparate silos. They're very separate. So what we really need are people to sort of connect the silos and examine, okay, where do these things overlay? Where do they mesh together? And one of the things that I think is fascinating is it's unlikely, unless you really start digging and reaching across the silos, to notice this sort of information. But some very bad pathogens have been studied in association with that particular allele, and they definitely have enhanced entry into human cells. Hep C, HIV, for example, and chlamydia pneumoniae. The elementary bodies that are infectious get into cells easier in patients that have that allele. So I wonder, ultimately, it would be really good to see more research done in and around people that have that particular genetic variant and in the context of infection research. And that's one of the holes that I think needs to be filled in.
So one of the things that could be said is that association is not necessarily causation. And so the fact that we do see evidence of these bacteria or viruses in the brain doesn't necessarily mean that they are the cause of dementia. What do you say about that?
Sure. I mean, that is the absolute truth. Anyone that's a scientist will say it is incredibly difficult to say that any microorganism causes a disease. We know the challenges that Barry Marshall faced in highlighting the role of Helicobacter pylori in gastric ulcers, and that it's not only challenging scientifically, but it's challenging from an emotional and intellectual standpoint, because I think human beings are pretty averse to change. And I think that there has been a thought process over many decades that amyloid beta and tau and other things that we're finding in the brain in the sick regions of Alzheimer's patients are actually driving the disease, or that those things are the disease in and of themselves, when we're coming to realize that perhaps those things are the body's response to another underlying process. But what I suggest is that it's not good enough for everyone to step back and say, oh, well, association doesn't mean causation. That's very easy to say, but then not act on it. So what I think needs to be done is more organizations, big pharma companies that have pipelines in neurodegeneration need to start looking at infectious agents. They need to start looking at the microbiome and seeing if they can, develop and innovate in and around that. In fact, there is a company that provides, I think, it's great proof of concept that this idea that infections could be driving Alzheimer's is viable from a business standpoint, is Cortexime, which is the company that is coming to market. They're in phase 2B right now with a product that is against Porphyromonas gingivalis, which is a gum bacteria that's also been found in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. And their agent very selectively inhibits that one organism and a chemical produced by the organism called gingipanes. And so, it's proof that the market is also ready for something different. But I would like to see more scientists at these well-funded research programs around the globe looking at microorganisms. And I know that's not easy because it's a big shift in what you're currently doing. And then to ramp up and be a laboratory that works with viruses and bacteria requires effort. However, I like to think that part of my role with Intracell Research Group is to connect scientists today. If you're watching this program and you're interested in pivoting what you look at and starting to explore this concept, I can connect you with others who are willing to share their methods and how they've gone ahead to, build their research programs. But there aren't enough people looking at it for the extent that the evidence is compelling. I think we need a greater look.
Well, one thing is for certain is that with the failure of big pharma recently in the past few years, there's never been a better time to look at alternative ways of focusing on dementia. And so probably one of the best times to do it may be now. Here's an interesting question I thought of, though, in the context of what you said, because you could imagine that if you gave antibiotics that someone could improve, and think, therefore, that because they have improved, it does mean that the infection was probably related to the brain. But one of the things I just remembered, one of the greatest uses of antibiotics is in animals and in animal feed, and they actually get better and perform better just by giving them antibiotics. Could we therefore see, if we did see an improvement, how would we know if it's necessarily infection in the brain or infection in the gut?
You can't know, actually, and I'll say this a million times over. I don't know scientifically if we use broad spectrum antimicrobials like the kind that would kill something like chlamydia pneumoniae, you're also killing a whole lot of other things while you're doing that. So no one with any scientific background would sit and say, oh, I know I killed this and it led to this. So that again gets back to how challenging it's going to be to ascribe a causative role to the pathogen. However, I would say this is that if some clinical trials like the one my group has designed to test generic antibiotics, which would be very inexpensive from the drug standpoint, in early Alzheimer's disease in patients that have elevated titers to specific bacterial pathogens. If it works, then it's tough to argue, that it wasn't valuable. And then you could always go back and pursue understanding the mechanism of action. But I'll point out that the majority of drugs on the market today, and I know this coming from big pharma and medium-sized biotech, we don't know their mechanism of action. And that's a fact. And the other thing about antibiotics that's important to note is they have pleiotropic effects, meaning effects outside of their antimicrobial capabilities. They are excellent anti-inflammatories. A lot of antibiotics also have antiviral effects, such as azithromycin, which is being looked at in terms of COVID. It also can inhibit herpes simplex virus. So the thing is, if an antimicrobial is given, unless it's a very specific mechanism that the antimicrobial leverages, like, for example, the molecule that Cortexime has that specifically inhibits gingipanes and P. gingivalis, then it'll be very difficult to say that one pathogen was the criminal.
So when we look at it, because some of the concepts here are pretty high level concepts, and so I'm thinking about breaking it down a little bit. So in effect, the theory would say that over many years, people have got basically a low-grade chronic infection that involves the central nervous system, but it wouldn't be severe enough to cause symptoms like a meningitis or an encephalitis. It's kind of low-grade inflammation. Exactly. And therefore, it would then cause the symptoms or the cognitive impairment that can occur. And I guess from your experience, that does occur with things like Lyme disease as a side effect.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So certainly when you look at the pathogens, like you take chlamydia and herpes simplex, especially by age like 60 and above, the prevalence, the seroprevalence really rises. So the number of people that are infected is quite high. With chlamydia, it's 80%. actually have evidence of previous infection. And the thing is that the infectious agents, particularly chlamydia and herpes, are sort of insidious. Like herpes, hides out and then reappears and then hides out again. And chlamydia grows very slowly. So it's not a really fast growing pathogen. So it's not one that, will be the most virulent pathogen, but it is an immune modulating pathogen, which means it gets into the immune cells and it actually manipulates them to its own benefit. And so our immune cells are supposed to turn over and die periodically. When they're no good anymore, they should just go away, and chlamydia can actually delay that process. So I like to call it like that creepy show, The Walking Dead, where you have like these zombie immune cells that they should be gone, they should be dead, and they're still kicking around because chlamydia is manipulating those cells. So in effect, it is an immune modulating infection, which is a bad thing. And then as we age, we know that the immune senescence, or the health of the immune system, is decreased. So that could help explain the distribution of a high number of cases of Alzheimer's disease and dementia associated with aging. It's that, some people picked up the infection earlier in life and it's been slow growing and brewing. And then others perhaps are more vulnerable based upon genetics and other factors. Certainly there are other things that get involved, like environmental exposure, lifestyle, how you treat your body, what you eat, and all of those things have become quite fascinating to me. Like, for example, the information on diet and exercise, and how by eating more of a Mediterranean diet and by exercising and even caloric restriction, you can reduce your propensity to develop Alzheimer's or dementia. And I have the hypothesis that it actually has bearing on the immune system. The more plant-based foods we eat, the more fresh foods we eat, we're actually eating the chemicals that the plants use to defend themselves in nature. And in doing so, a lot of these plant chemicals have their own natural antimicrobial activity. So I think that there remains to be a lot of work done in better understanding, some of the scientific evidence that we have right now, and tying the silos together to better understand a bigger picture. Because I always feel like it's a 1,000-piece puzzle with Alzheimer's disease, and we have corners of the puzzle put together where we understand certain elements and aspects of it, but we're missing the pieces in the middle that tie it together.
Yes. So you're not saying, I'll ask the question then. I think that it's an ethical question.
Yeah.
We are at a situation in the world where the resources to care for the elderly, especially persons with dementia, will be significantly reduced after this. And more than ever, we need solutions for persons to try and reduce the risk or even improve their function. Are we at a point, you think, where for people who have dementia or their families, to just giving them prolonged courses of antibiotics, weighing the risk versus the benefit, so to speak? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. So I like to think of myself as sort of a broad view of all of the infection work. Most of my knowledge is in and around chlamydia pneumoniae infection. That's where I'd say I have more expertise, but I interact with all of the different scientists from the different camps, if you will, to understand and to make sense of all of the information. And what I know for sure is that right now we are adequately addressing the herpes viruses, and the evidence showing that they are heavily associated, herpes simplex, the cold sore virus, with Alzheimer's disease. There is a prospective randomized trial looking at the antiviral drug valsiclovir, Valtrex, in patients with early Alzheimer's disease and evidence of herpes infection. So that's happening. That's fabulous. The other thing is happening, obviously, Cortexime is looking at Porphyromonas gingivalis with their product, which would be a branded agent. And then there's also a company looking at the gut microbiome. They're called Shanghai Green Valley Pharma, and they have something called oligomanate, which is derived from seaweed. And they believe their mechanism of action is gut remodeling, although I think that sort of remains to be seen from looking at their literature exactly what the agent does, but it seems the results are promising initially. And then the thing where I think there's a major gap as to what you referenced is antibiotic trials. There have been a few antibiotic trials in early, late onset Alzheimer's disease. However, they were not powered to detect efficacy, neither of the trials. They conflicted with one another. The first trial showed a trend toward improvement in terms of some cognitive scores at 6 months in the antibiotic arm versus the placebo arm. The second trial did not duplicate those results. However, our group, my consortium, has leveraged the expertise of a multitude of physicians and researchers to hone a more adequate clinical trial that would be very specific and targeted, looking at patients that are testing positive for chlamydia pneumoniae infection. Because both of the antibiotic trials that were done, they did not include or exclude patients based on infection status, which we think was a flaw in the trial design. And so there are multiple ways in which we could design better trials. And to your point about the unmet need, we absolutely should do so, because in the trials that were done looking at antibiotics in Alzheimer's disease, they were very well tolerated and there weren't any serious adverse events. The placebo arm and the treatment arm looked very similar, and they were using some significant antibiotics. They used rifampin and doxycycline. So it's definitely called for at this point. And the drugs themselves are inexpensive, but the research is not, because we have to design a trial that's rather lengthy, because these infections of the CNS and brain require a longer period of treatment.
Absolutely. So in closing then, if you had all the power in the world, you had direct access to the people who had all the power in the world, sure, what would you want them to be doing now to try and help in this particular concept with the infection and dementia?
I would love to see better studies looking at cerebrospinal fluid and risk stratification of patients and seeing who has what infections, and then leveraging things like AI, to really analyze huge data sets. I think if we put some serious numbers behind it, we could begin to draw some meaningful conclusions about those that are infected with various pathogens and then develop various forms of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. I would love to see more people get involved. I don't like hearing, oh, well, it's just an association, but then no one works on it. And I think that that's the challenge, right? Is to inspire others to say, okay, stealth pathogens are inherently very difficult to work with. You can ask the microbiologists that do so. They're not particularly easy to manipulate. They're very difficult to culture and grow. However, it's a worthy exploration because by definition, they are hiding, they are stealth, and they're the type of criminals, in my opinion, sort of holding the smoking gun. They should really be looked at. So I'd love to see more people get involved, and I'd love to see big pharma companies that have these neurodegeneration pipelines diversify their pipelines toward anti-infectives and looking in that direction, because I do believe that it is the future of where we can, at least for a subset of patients, alter the course of our understanding and really begin to innovate around some of the work that's been done.
Wonderful. Tremendous, Nikki. As I mentioned at the start, I think that your story is incredibly inspiring. I think that you're somebody who took your own circumstance and you are using it to help others by doing a lot of research. And your research, I've been so impressed by the depth of your knowledge. I say kudos to you. Wonderful stuff that you're doing. And I really, really encourage you to continue with your work. Thank you very much. We look forward. Love to follow this up again in the future when hopefully you've gotten the WHO on board and everything.
I hope so. Thank you for shedding light on this disease and doing these videos. It's a wonderful opportunity for people to learn.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Philip, take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.